Dogs and Men by Mary Ansell. Chapter 1. Porthos, the St. Bernard. Porthos was the first dog I possessed, and that was after I was married. He was a St. Bernard. Following Porthos came Luath, the Newfoundland, then Billy, the Old English bobtail, and then Sammy, the son of Billy. They didn't really follow one another. There were happy days when Luath, Billy, and Sammy all strolled with me through the morning. And then came the sad day 7 years ago when Sammy died, and I had no more dogs to care for. I never had any children, but I have had 2 husbands, and strangely enough to me, I only had a dog while I had a husband. Now I am alone again, and I have no dog. Husbands and dogs seem to coincide in my life. I never really wanted a dog. I don't even like it when human beings, especially women, lavish a misguided affection on an unfortunate animal. I never wanted to do it. Yet the roundness, the softness, the innocence, the fascinating candor of those St. Bernard puppies just tugged at my heartstrings, and when I saw Porthos, I gave in. It was a fall, but I abide by my fall. The sight of babies rouses mixed feelings in me. I am not quite happy with them. Something about them puts me off, their humanness, to tell the truth. They are little people. I have never been really happy with people. Some constraint tightens me up when I am with them. They seem so inside themselves, so unwilling to reveal their real selves. I am always asking for something they won't give me. I try to pierce into their reserves. Sometimes I feel I am succeeding, but they close in again, and I'm left outside. But with animals, it is different. An animal is so helplessly itself. Tiny animals go straight to my heart. I can't help it, but my heart warms with tenderness for them. Their candor, their surprising confidence disarms me. I become one with them. I, too, become helplessly myself. They never withhold themselves from me as men withhold themselves. When the dogs loved me, they did it without forethought or afterthought because they couldn't help it. But men didn't love me unless they wanted to, unless I fitted in with their idea of me. The dogs didn't have any idea of me. They just loved me with a passion and warmth without thinking about it. I only loved clever men, and clever men, it seems to me, are made up of reserves. It is out of their reserves they bring their clever things. You think they will one day open their reserves, and that you will be the favored one who is admitted to the cupboards where they keep their cleverness. But that is an illusion. The reserves of men are as helpless as a dog's lack of reserve is helpless. A man had to be clever, really clever, to please me. And I loved my dogs so passionately because they could never be clever in that way. They could never be complicated as the men were complicated. Perhaps my love for dogs in the beginning was a sort of mother love. Porthos was a baby when I first saw him, a fat little round young thing, the dearest of all in a lovely litter of St. Bernards away there in Switzerland. My heart burnt hot for love of him. I wanted to carry him there and then away with me. It was something of a blow to me that I couldn't do that, so it was arranged that the lovely tubby thing should be sent home to me. And so, a little while after my return to London, arrived a huge package, and in it was the poor little forlorn object that became Porthos. He had grown so much on the way as to be almost unrecognizable. Poor little Porthos, he had lost some of his tubbiness and grown rather stocky, rather long in the shank, and a bit rickety. He was a stranger, and I looked at him critically. Of course, his master named him. I could never have thought of anything so clever as that, only of Dick or Nero or Rover or Glenn. Indeed, for a few minutes I did call him Glenn. But Porthos seemed clever and appropriate, and I wanted, naturally, my dog to have a clever name. Later I thought Athos would have suited him better. Certainly not Aramis. He grew so fast, and his legs, all out of proportion, were so unsteady that he appeared to be tottering into his grave instead of having only just tottered into life. No bit of him grew together, a leg at a time, as it were, and he always looked so aged. As he grew older, he grew younger, and finally emerged into a handsome St. Bernard dog. But for a considerable period there were moments when I had dismal forebodings he might grow into anything. When he was only 6 months, strangers would speak of him as "that old dog of yours." I was always explaining that he was really quite a youngster. They never believed me and thought I was boasting. I was so exasperated about it that I nearly had his birth certificate tied to his collar. If all of him had only grown at the same time, it would not have been so bad, but for a whole year no part of him seemed to fit the other. He was my first puppy. He was like a great big plaything, a huge, living, breathing plaything. He took up such a lot of my time, there was never a dull moment. I washed him like a handkerchief. His coat was tan color, with some white about the neck and tail. That tan color and that white must be spotless. Not a speck would I have on them. I had the same feelings about the laurel bushes in the garden. I used to wash them with a sponge until their lovely green color reappeared out of the London soot. But when Porthos came, I left off washing them. Life would not be long enough to cope with both of them. Porthos fondly hoped I would give him up, but he had no success. Every week he had his scrubbing in the backyard, and a very inferior figure he cut during the proceedings. Generally he had to be dragged from the top of the house, where he had hidden part of himself under the bed, to the yard. When I had got him covered from head to foot in soap, often he escaped and ran back again to the bed for safety. The maid was not pleased about this, I can tell you. Why the servants never downed tools, I cannot think. Always a cleaning up after him, they said. But they really loved him almost as much as I did, and willingly followed him around, wiping up the mess his dirty feet left behind him. Only one servant hated him, but not for long, I saw to that, and her successor soon fell a victim to his blandishments. He thought I overdid it about the washing business. Perhaps I did. It has been always a failing of mine. I am only now beginning to wonder whether it is necessary to be so very clean. The other dogs didn't need washing. They went into a pond dirty and came out clean. Porthos didn't like going into water, and when he did go in, he came out just as dirty. He hated my washing him, yet he loved me just as much. Little likes or dislikes make no difference in a dog's love. It is only humans who get disturbed by them. Porthos said, "I hate her washing ways, but she means well, and I love her." He very soon found out the kind of woman I was. My failings never troubled him. I often spoke sharply to him. I sometimes even beat him. He was so wicked with the cushions, and he gnawed the chair legs and ate up one's slippers. Things were generally at 6s and 7s whilst he was a puppy. Sometimes I couldn't bear it and beat him, but I was always sorry for it afterwards. One mustn't beat so young and foolish a thing as a puppy or a child. There is some other way, but at the moment that other way seemed such a long way off, and I beat him. I didn't really hurt him, but it was just the same thing. A little slap on the face hurt him so much inside that he was crushed by it. He lay on the floor with his head on his paws, his large, solemn, soft brown eyes fixed on me, following every movement I made. He lay there waiting for me to forgive him. He never thought of forgiving me. There's no such word in a dog's dictionary. They have so many better ways than we have. Being a human, I magnanimously forgave him. All right, Porthos, shake hands. In a moment a heavy paw was offered me. I shook it solemnly, and all was well in the world as far as he was concerned. He didn't remain very long a puppy, not so long as Loath. One morning, with a heavy shake of his huge body, he shook away all his puppy ways. He grew up, as it were, in a single moment, while your eyes were on him. He ceased to eat the slippers, he found out cushions were pleasant things to rest his head upon, and he lost his taste for chair legs. Some childish ways remained with him to the end. His love for toys, his passion for one or two games, his delicious joke that he was a sporting dog. Every afternoon we walked in the Kensington Gardens. On the way we called at a certain toy shop, now swallowed up by its big brothers, to buy a toy for Porthos. "What aged child would the toy be for?" demanded the shop lady. Such an embarrassing question, for there stood the child, eagerly eyeing them. But I couldn't let on, could I? So I muttered incoherently something under my breath and chose the thing I knew he liked the best. Porthos, in the meantime, was trying to pick one out for himself. He adored dolls and things that wound up and ran round and round by themselves. Every evening we were kept busy winding them up for him. He never broke them, that is, on purpose, and he loved them even when they were worn out or broken of themselves. He had few tricks. None of the dogs were good at them, but there was one he fancied prodigiously. We would ask him to choose his favorite author from out of the bookshelves. Carefully he nosed about them. Mysteriously he peered into the corners. Then he solemnly chose one and brought it to us. It was always the same one, and to his shame, be it said, a yellow-backed shocker. He giggled with delight at this trick and flung about his enormous tail and smirked and grimaced. He invited himself to do it all over again. Given the least encouragement, he would, I believe, have gone on doing it to the crack of doom. He only had one other trick, and that was posting a letter. "Post a letter," I would say, and away went down his capacious throat a slice of bread and butter. When he was 2 years old, he showed signs of delicacy. We never found out what was really the matter with him. It was a kind of general thing, something in his stomach not quite right. I was always physicking him. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom got full of the different drugs I tried on him. He took them quite amiably. Indeed, he often came and asked me for them. There was a funny incident regarding that medicine cabinet. Nobody was supposed to go to it except me, but one day when I came home, one of the household informed me that, having a bad headache, she had taken an antipyrine powder from a box in the cupboard, adding that it had done her a lot of good. A horrid suspicion came into my mind. Quickly I sped to the bathroom. My suspicions were correct. She had swallowed one of the dog's vermifuge cachets. I had put them in an empty antipyrine box. I vowed I had written on the lid to that effect, but my writing has never been my strong point. But there it was. The headache was cured, and that was all that was asked of it. Porthos was now a fully grown dog, still rather rickety about the legs, but a handsome dog with a fine head. Indeed, his head was the best part of him. He and Loath were about the same size, but there the resemblance ceased. They were both wise, but not about the same things. Porthos, by the way he took life, might have known all about it before he became part of it. It never surprised him. He was not one of those of whom it might be said he was born again every morning. He came prepared as to what kind of place the world was. He knew there were plenty of sharp corners. He was not going to knock himself against any of them. He was an affectionate, ponderous, heavy-thinking kind of a dog. It was his sense of humor that kept him from being dull. It was the leaven that lightened what might have been otherwise a rather stodgy character. That and his love of toys, and he had a great sense of the decency of life. He was never quarrelsome. One felt his philosophy was to take no notice of what others did, but be careful not to do it himself. To watch him play with a kitten, a fluffy little Persian, was to learn a lesson in chivalry. Always the kitten came out top. Only once did Porthos score off him. That was when the kitten was running a piece of coal all over the floor. Now Porthos had been told it was not the thing to do this, nor to eat it, which he often did, and had received one of my little slaps for so doing. For a time he watched the kitten whilst it delightedly chased the coal from side to side. Then he looked at me. Was I not to do something in the matter? No, I was not. I was busy sewing. He remained quietly thinking. Then he arose, walked majestically across to the kitten, picked up the piece of coal, and dropped it into the coal scuttle. I felt his reproachful eyes burning into me as he passed. I knew I owed him an apology. Soon after the gramophone became a general acquisition, one was lent to us by a friend. During lunch, we turned it on to amuse Porthos. It was one of those music hall turns, a sort with lots of patter between the verses and a great deal of silly laughter. Porthos listened to it, at first in amazement, then with extraordinary interest, sitting down close to it so as not to miss a word. At that moment, Peter Cat strolled in. He gave one startled, horrified glance at Porthos and fled, fully convinced that the dog had suddenly acquired the gift of human speech. Poor Peter! It was a considerable time before he would venture into that room again, and I don't think he was ever after sure of what Porthos would be up to next. Perhaps I was wrong when I say Porthos was never born again. I had forgotten all the parcels. If he was ever born again, it was when he saw a parcel. Having seen so many produce toys for himself, he got into the way of thinking that all parcels were his property. Woe betide you, or rather your parcel, if you left it within his reach, and his reach was far and lofty. If you wanted a quiet life and had any parcels, it was as well to keep them concealed from Porthos. Now, many people hate to hear a dog bark, but there are barks and barks, just as there are voices and voices. Much talking is only a noise. A really nice dog only barks when he wants to express something. Very few people talk for that reason. Sometimes a dog is silent for hours. You seldom find a human so considerate. Porthos always barked when he saw a parcel, and more, he became hysterical if he were not attended to at once. At Christmas you might well imagine what he was like. Parcels arriving by the score, all to be untied, and alas, for his poor missus, all to be retied again. It was an ecstatic time. He stood watching, beating his feet on the floor, hardly able to wait for me to undo the string. How much quicker he could have done it was what he was thinking. Every toy he liked better than the last, but there was one doll, a real beauty. Badly he wanted it. Sadly he watched it being done up again into a parcel, this time with a card tied to it. All my work being finished, I went upstairs. He remained lying in the hall, gloomily thinking. After a time, I was struck by a curious silence, and, looking over the banister, saw Porthos. Cardboard box, string, and paper were scattered in confusion about him. Between his paws was the doll. We looked at one another. "I couldn't help it," his eyes said. "You are an adorable darling," mine replied, but I had to take it away. It was much too good for him. Not that I thought many things were too good for him, but it was made into a parcel again, and this time the door locked on it. But he got a doll nearly as beautiful for his Christmas present, and he untied the parcel himself. He passionately loved his master. He really loved him more than he did me. It was a case of Mary and Martha. I gave him medicine and kept him clean and generally looked after him, but his master played with him, and he was a genius at games. They had fearful wrestling matches. These went on until both were exhausted, and they ran races in and out of the rooms, up and down the stairs, out of the front door, in by the back, over and over and over again. There were times when I held my breath. Would any of my treasured bits of furniture survive? A wild whirl of Porthos's tail, and over went the hat stand. Mats and rugs were scattered in every direction. When it was all over, I went round collecting the debris. At first I was sad that Porthos loved his master more than me, but he loved me too, so much that I didn't really miss the bit more. His heart was so full of love for both of us. It has always puzzled me why dogs are so devoted to humans. Anyone of their kind they would desert at a word from us. The whole lot of them, if we only lift a finger. Stevenson says, "The best in us is better than we think it is." Perhaps it's wisest to leave it at that. A Scottish woman once complained to me of the lavish use we made of the word love. "You English," she said scornfully, "love everything. Your beer, beef, cars, dogs, husbands, wives, children. You love them all." "But why not," I answered, "use so darling a word whenever you can? You Scots save it for some supreme occasion, which seldom comes, and you go down to your graves without ever saying it." But she wasn't in the least convinced. To her it was like wearing your best clothes every day. Well, I like wearing my best clothes every day, and I don't believe in supreme occasions. Now that I am alone, I have taken to talking to myself in order to say all the delicious things I would like to hear continually being said to me. There is no end to the affectionate one-sided conversation that goes on between me and the other one. Heaven only knows what the servants think if they overhear me. "Dotty," I expect they say, a tapping of their foreheads. But one must let the steam off somehow. And that's what dogs can always do. Think of what they express with their tails, and how easily, every emotion. Perhaps it is a pity we have grown out of ours. End of chapter 1.
Porthos in Scotland. Humans are not the only ones who aspire to be something that nature has been particularly careful to emphasize is entirely unsuited to them. Porthos, a huge and massive creature with legs never intended for nimble running and a brain, although quick enough for the ordinary things of life, was quite unable to cope with the agility of rabbits, yet imagined himself in the role of a sportsman. I think he got fired with the idea, preposterous as it must seem, the day he caught a young sparrow in the backyard. Caught is perhaps not quite the correct word. As a matter of fact, I believe the little thing fell into his clutches whilst being taught to fly by its parents. I only arrived on the scene when the sparrow was actually between his paws, so cannot vouch for the accuracy of my belief. But there it was, and from the tree above issued a succession of mournful lamentations. Under Porthos's paw lay the little panting creature. Not a feather was ruffled, so lightly it rested on it. What was he going to do with it? I waited to see, knowing that a word from me would make him release it. The bird never moved. Porthos hardly breathed. It was almost unbearable. Then, evidently getting bored with the dullness of the game, or puzzled as to what was the proper thing to do next, he threw a glance to heaven for guidance, at the same moment raising his paw. The bird seized the opportunity and escaped into the tree, where it was speedily joined by its distressed parent. Porthos heaved a deep sigh, walked up the steps, and lay down on his mat with the air of one who has had a heaven-sent revelation about himself. Now I can't help thinking that from that moment he got possessed of the monstrous idea that gives the opportunity he would do great things in the field. Every year we went to Scotland, and in Scotland, as you know, There are many rabbits. There was one place in particular near where we had a house where the fields were alive with them. You went up a little hillock, and there they were, playing about in their charming and innocent way, unconscious of the danger lurking around the corner. Aping the manner of the sporting dog, Porthos would silently, breathlessly point. I think it is called pointing up the slope. At the top, with a scream, he was off. Rabbits to the right of him, rabbits to the left of him, rabbits before and behind him, running for dear life in search of cover. Only for the first time, though. After that, they took it more quietly, and after several times they looked upon it as a joke and played touch with him. Never once did he get within measurable distance of even the littlest, although he nearly killed himself in the attempt. He came back so thoroughly exhausted that it was only with difficulty that we got him home, and at last we decided that that particular field was for the future taboo. But he was not in the least dismayed. There were more ways than one of catching a rabbit. He thought out a brilliant scheme. He had noticed that they disappeared down holes at the foot of trees. Very soon in the wood at the end of the garden, several hillocks arose where none had been before, resembling large ant heaps. It was Porthos digging a subterranean passage from tree to tree. He very soon got one large enough to admit his head and shoulders. It was a big idea, and it might in time have come off, but something happened to cut short his labors. It was the arrival of two little dogs, fox terriers, belonging to some friends who were visiting us. Very seldom one admires the dogs of other people, especially if they are staying with you, but these were particularly unpleasant dogs. The day they arrived, they killed 2 hedgehogs, most useful in the garden and friends of Porthos. Then they took possession of his best hole and continued digging. It wouldn't have mattered if they had been able to dig, but their silly little paws merely scattered a few grains of sand. Porthos, perfect gentleman that he was, never said a word. He bore it all without remonstrance. There were visitors staying in the house, and as such must be allowed certain liberties. But there was one thing he would not stand, and one morning there was a terrific scene. The Mr. Terrier had dared to be over-demonstrative to his beloved master. Then he saw red. One could almost hear him say, "You have taken my hedgehogs, you have taken my holes, but by golly, you shall not take my master." And in a trice, he had the terrier by the throat. We thought his last hour had come, and it certainly would have if left to Porthos, but he was pulled off before much damage was done. Meanwhile, Mrs. Terrier had come to the rescue of her husband, and bitten any leg she could lay her teeth on. What a scene it was! For quite a time 2 men, 2 women, and 3 dogs were, to say the least of it, uncomfortable with one another. And the end of the matter was that one day Peter Cat, the one that was the kitten, walked in with a fine rabbit in his mouth, and laid it at the feet of the dogs with a grin. That was the only time Porthos forgot his dignity, forgot all the principles hitherto had ruled his life, and became a real primitive dog. Louis passed through one terrific emotional crisis. When middle-aged, he fell for the first time in love. Porthos never fell in love. He gave no thought to such a possibility, as though it never existed. The population of the dog world may have to be kept up, but not by him. You see what depths his philosophy led him? I have often wondered what sort of a husband Porthos would have made, or Louis, if either of them had happened to be a man, instead of a 4-footed dog. It is almost impossible to translate their spontaneous doggedness into human terms, but I can't help thinking that Porthos would have remained a bachelor, one of those interesting beings with either a melancholy past or romantic present, the kind that women find so interesting. His past dedicated to the memory of some fair creature who jilted him, or his present engrossed in affectionate relationship strictly correct, with someone already married to another. He would have made a wonderful friend, and, after all, is there anything finer to be said of anyone than that? He had one peculiarity. He hated men with beards. I haven't the least idea why. Psychoanalysis, maybe, might be able to enlighten us on the subject. Anyhow, the fact remains that he had a passionate dislike for men with beards. Whenever one came to the house, Porthos would sit quite close, keeping a troubled eye on him. Every now and again he put out a paw to shake hands. This naturally took the bearded one's attention. "Your dog seems to like me," he would say, bridling, for one always is pleased when dogs or children notice one. I left it at that. Why disturb his pleasant memory of that visit? But I knew that it was Porthos's way of saying, "Go away, I don't like you. Take your horrid beard away, I hate it." End of chapter 2. Porthos in the pulpit. It was during one of our visits to Scotland that the scandalous affair of the St. Bernard dog in the pulpit took place, in what is called there the Free Kirk. We were sitting reverently in our pew, waiting for the minister to come out of the vestry, when to our horror we saw Porthos. He passed up the aisle, ascended the stairs, and entered the pulpit. Leaning his head over the Bible, he took stock of the congregation. It sat spellbound, with fierce eyes fixed on him. Had a miracle happened? Had a new prophet arisen? Were they to have a sermon the like of which they had never dreamed? My only thought was to get him out of the pulpit before he did speak, which would have been infinitely more disturbing than his presence. Happily, my sister-in-law, with commendable presence of mind, went to the foot of the stairs and gently called him. Joyfully he responded. Here was somebody at last that he knew. She caught him by the collar and led him out of the church. Then the congregation heaved a sigh, and it almost smiled. It took a considerable time to live down the scandal of that scene. To this day there is a garbled version of it. In years to come, no doubt, it will reach heroic dimensions. And who knows but that it may end by Porthos being gathered into the arms of either the churches of England or of Rome, and given the name Saint Porthos. In the meantime, behind the curtained windows of the houses, the occupants watched the daily walks of the notorious one with his family. And so well-mannered had we all to be, that it was more than my reputation was worth to whistle when I wanted to attract his attention. Dogs in Scotch churches seem liable to lose all control over themselves. A friend saw the other day, whilst she was waiting for the Holy Communion, a terrier in Aberdeen sit up on his haunches and beg before the elements. In a trice, a scandalized deacon had cast him forth. But a Welsh terrier here in London went one better. His mistress left him alone in her studio, and on her return found he had eaten the Bible from cover to cover. He is still busy digesting it, but showing signs that he is an entirely reformed character. It is not surprising that Porthos, living as he did in a house with a master given over to the things of the theater, should, when the opportunity arose, show signs of possessing exceptional histrionic gifts. No doubt, as he lay on the sofa in his master's study and watched him at his work and saw him showing his characters the way they should do it, and he sometimes did this most impressively, he thought to himself, there doesn't seem much in that, and it's almost as amusing as playing with toys. So that, when one day a play was written by his master, with a part in it of a dog, and wonderful to relate, a Saint Bernard, he was, as they say, very bucked up, and looked forward with no small amount of enjoyment to showing himself off, for dogs love to show themselves off, and, to tell the truth, so do humans. It was a play for children, and took place in the drawing-room, and was acted by his master and missus, and many now famous authors and actors. Porthos's part was one of those that plays itself. At least, that is how the actors who are not playing it speak of it. It was a showy part, not a great deal to do, but every action was to the point. I was the heroine, escorted every morning to her school in the woods by her big dog. The point here was that he got a biscuit before leaving her, and when, as it happened on this occasion, he didn't get it, he refused to budge. He would neither shake hands nor go back home until this mistake had been rectified. All this he did to the life, especially the biscuit part of it. In the second act, he defended the hero from the devilry of the villain, his master. This was done by holding him in the wings until a given signal, when he was let loose. Then he rushed onto the stage, sprang upon the villain, and wrestled with him until he was overthrown. It was a consummate performance, and the curtain came down to thunderous applause. Again and again he was called before the curtain, and ended by walking across the footlights amongst the children, who then discovered that he was a real dog and not a man, like the bear made up to resemble one. It was a wonderful afternoon, only marred, and there is always something to mar perfect things, by a child infecting all the rest with measles. Harrowing for their poor mammas, but I think the children thought it was worth it. I have very little more to write about Porthos. His life was a short one, not much more than half of that of Louis. His health had been giving us a great deal of trouble. He more frequently asked me for medicine, but, alas, medicine ceased to bring him any relief. Once he was sent away to a vet, but early the next morning he was found outside the gate, his chain in half. He gradually grew weaker. There was nothing to be done. He was slowly, surely dying. When it became impossible to have him any longer about the house, he was sent to that humane institution, the dog's home at Battersea, and in the lethal chamber he was put peacefully to sleep. Buried with him were 7 years of my youth. He had known the girl just started out on the great adventure, hands outstretched, demanding what life had to give her. Perhaps I loved Louis and Sammy more than I loved Porthos. One can't help whom one loves more. It just happens. But he was my first dog. He had all the first warmth of my love for dogs. And he had shared with me those first 7 years of my married life. None of the others could take his place. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4. Louis, the Newfoundland. It was some time after the death of Porthos before I began to think of another dog. I busied myself with other things. A cottage in the country, the making of a garden, the driving of a tiny motor car. But it was of no use. I simply ached to have another puppy. I looked back on the adorable thing Porthos had been. I even had hopes of finding one more adorable. You see how far I had fallen, and I wasn't by any means at the bottom yet. I missed everything that Porthos had been to me. What was the use of going out when there was no dog to dance happily by my side? What pleasure in coming back when no wild greeting awaited me? The dogs always knew when I was going out without them. They knew by the clothes I put on. Those I wore when going a walk with them were quite different from the ones I went a-visiting in. They soon found that out. And when it was the party clothes, their faces grew sadder and sadder, and before I had got through with my dressing, they had crept away and hidden themselves in a corner and remained there until I had left the house. They held no resentment against me for it, and were always ready to welcome me on my return. It is very easy to see why women love their dogs so devotedly. From nobody else do we get such flattering attentions. A man takes you as a matter of course. You are there, just as his dinner is there. Unless you do something extremely odd, you cease to surprise him. But every time your dog looks at you, it is as though it were for the first time. "What an amazing person you are," he cries, "and how exquisite." "You're a funny old darling," you reply, but nevertheless believe it. There was a time when old maids and their dogs provided the comic papers with most of their humour. The war has changed all that. The woman bachelor can never be accused of anything so frivolous as a fancy for pets. She is much too busy with other things. But if the unmarried have forsworn them, the married woman has feverishly adopted them. She has found out not only the pleasure, but the advantage gained by having a dog about the house. I go so far as to assert that no married woman should be without one. And every husband, that is, if he values his future comfort and repose, should see to it that a dog forms part of the equipment of the house to which he proposes to bring his bride. For a dog makes a most admirable accompaniment to a husband. He supplies those darling little ways, so dear to a woman's heart, and so necessary to her well-being, that come tripping along so gracefully before marriage, but by the end of the first year have tripped away, less gracefully, into oblivion. My women readers will, I am sure, see my point at once. To quote an instance, those silent meals. Haven't most of us experienced them? When the mind of your man is elsewhere, Lord knows where, but nowhere in your direction. Just when the silence is becoming unbearable, your dog steps in and attracts your attention. He lays his head on your knee, or he presses your hand as it is in the act of conveying a succulent morsel to your mouth. Merely asking for food, you interrupt. Quite true, but to be asked for anything is a relief. And with how much charm he does it, and with what an adoring glance he rewards you for the titbits you pop into his mouth. Your heart begins at once to warm up again, and the whole balance of life is restored. Every household has its own peculiar situation. Perhaps I am quoting the most common one. But however trying it may be, you may rely on your dog to ease it. In fact, he will carry on where his master leaves off. You can see how impossible it was for me to exist long without the companionship of a creature so discerning. I looked about me and found Luath. I had come across his father at the various dog shows. He was a well-known pot hunter, a magnificent beast. I thought the son of such a father would be first-rate. And he was, after a time, but when he first arrived, a sorrier-looking little chap I had never seen. A dull-looking puppy, with scarcely a wag to his tail, and with none of the tricks common to puppies. But he was a beauty to look at, a black and white ball of fluff. You could never tell which end of him was looking at you, both were so alike. But I hated his dull ways. I spent hours trying to turn him into something that resembled a puppy. Then it dawned upon me that perhaps he was unwell, so I called in a vet. The first prescribed whisky, Irish for choice, but Scotch if you had no other. Him I speedily abandoned. A man with such a peculiar sense of humour was not to be trusted to look after my latest acquisition. The new one regarded him gravely. "He's very ill," he said. "Pneumonia, pleurisy, distemper." He seemed so little to have so much the matter with him. "You had better send him back." "But he'll die if I do," I answered. "He'll die if you don't." Of course, he stayed, and I, who had been wanting something to occupy my days, found it with a vengeance. He was desperately ill. I made up a bed for him on a large divan in the conservatory that gave onto the drawing-room, and some nights I slept down there too, to be near him. He wanted constant attention, medicine every few hours, and his sad little body rubbed all over with iodine. But it was a pleasure to work for him, as the servants say of their masters. He was a dear, grateful ball of a thing, feebly trying to lick my hands as I rubbed him, and showing the faintest wag of a tail when I spoke kindly to him. One night he was desperately ill. I lay on my sofa very unhappy, all hope of saving him gone. I was just going off to sleep, this was in the early hours, when I heard a slight noise. I looked down and saw him playing with one of my bedroom slippers, the first attempt at a game since he entered the house. I could hardly believe my eyes, but there he was, and not looking a bit as though he had been at death's door an hour or two before. He was so weak he could hardly stand on his feet, large as they were, but he would insist on playing with that slipper. I nearly cried with joy. From that time he never looked back. He grew so fast that between breakfast and lunch he had shot up and out and around quite an inch, and between dinner and breakfast, well, all I can say is it was unbelievable. Unlike Porthos, he grew all together, every bit of him in unison. He had no angularities, not that I object to that in a pup, and also, unlike Porthos, he never looked old, not even when he was young. At 14, with his back to the light, he might have been taken for a 3-year-old. I hadn't reckoned with the personality of dogs. I rather expected to have another little Porthos. Surely all puppies are much the same, I thought. They are, as regards mischief. They all destroy everything within their reach. They all do the most desperately naughty things, but even these things they do in a different way. Porthos, very early, had said farewell to wild puppydom, but it clung to Louis for many years. Indeed, in some ways, he never lost it. The spirit of youth still held him by the hand right up to the end, although it had to walk very slowly to keep up with him. It might be said of him that he went through life on his hinder legs. This was true of him not only metaphorically, but physically. It was as easy for him to stand on his hind legs as it is for us. It was his wild spirits that got him there first of all. He took life so eagerly. He lived in the present. Porthos might be interested in his past, Sammy in his future, but the present was always good enough for Louis. And I must say, a mighty fine thing he made of it. Domesticity is what he was cut out for. He should have been a nurse. He should have been the father of a large family. Above all, he should have been a mother. An adverse fate denied him these delights, but he managed to manoeuvre something of them all into the 14 years of life that never failed to bring him an unreasoning happiness. He was called Louis. One of the dogs in Burns's Twa Dogs is called Louis, but outside that it is a pleasant-sounding name, a purring, happy-sounding name that just suited him. Porthos had always lived in the house. When he died, I made up my mind that if I ever had another dog, he should live outside in a kennel. I expect one of those tiresome people who like dogs in their place had been telling me that living in a kennel made them much healthier. I am all for being healthy and having a plastic and amiable disposition, and also an adventurous spirit. I thought that, as the pup had started life so badly, the night air might do him good and make a fine, strong dog of him. In fact, morally and physically, he would be all the better for it. So, a kennel was ordered to be made, big enough to allow for his growing. In due time, a small house arrived and was painted a lovely green and placed where the dog could keep an eye on the back door. When he was grown to a size suitable for the kennel, I tried to make him understand what it was for. Not a place for running in and out of, playing touch and such like childish things, but a place to sleep in, from where he could give a warning in the event of burglars. He listened to all this attentively, with his head cocked knowingly on one side, and then he went inside to inspect this new idea of a kennel. He came out with the mat in his mouth and proceeded to play shake the mat. But I was firm, for had I not told everybody sufficiently interested in dogs to listen of what I intended doing, I was not going to be put off by any of his little playful games. That night he was tied up in it, with a beautiful bone to keep him company. He was quiet just long enough for me to get into bed. Then he began. Shrieking is the only word to describe the noise that came from that kennel. I crept into a back room and called to him to be quiet. Politely at first, afterwards less so. Like a jack-in-the-box I was, in and out of my bed until the early hours of the morning, cajoling, pleading, threatening. Then I went down and let him in. Joyfully he greeted me, madly he rushed about the house, and finally, tired out, went to sleep on my bed, and quite grateful I was to warm my feet on him. Never again did he use that kennel, except as a lumber room for anything he wanted to hide. I came to the conclusion that it was not possible to make a dog live in a kennel if he didn't want to. That is, not in London, if you wish to keep the goodwill of your neighbours. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Luath, possessed of a devil. I started well with Luath, for after 2 or 3 weeks of constant nursing, a dog is disposed to regard you favourably. There was no question as to whom he loved best, and never once did he go back on me. It is true that as he grew up, his relations towards me changed. At first I was his mother, the one who had tended his poor little drooping body, the one who had entreated him not to die, the one who nearly hugged him to death when he obeyed her. But presently, as he grew in wisdom, and it was a slow growth, he began to take on a certain responsibility towards me. It was as though he developed a warm and ample bosom for me to weep on. "Never mind," he would whisper. "Never mind, I am here. Hold my collar and you'll be better." He couldn't bear that anyone should be unhappy. The crying of a child, the whimpering of a kitten really hurt him. He would lie on the floor with his head on his front paws, quite still, but his troubled eyes were never still. They sought and sought to encounter the slightest passing glance. If successful, his tail thumped out the sympathy he was feeling. I became a child with him. We played ridiculous games together. There was nothing too undignified that I wouldn't do at his asking, and he was always asking. Dancing was one of them, round and round the room. He loved this, and we kept it up till he was quite old. What races we ran in the Kensington Gardens, hiding behind trees. Catch me if you can. I am quite aware that my games, even at their wildest, were not a patch on those he had with his master, for he was an adept at games. But I didn't worry myself about it. I knew I was the favourite. Sometimes, wickedly, I went so far as proving it. During our walks in the gardens, I would turn back by myself and pretend to go home again. Luath never hesitated as to whom he followed. With an occasional glance round, a sudden halt, a sharp bark of questioning as to what I meant by it, he followed me. He was never really comfortable, to tell the truth, unless we were together. He hated those walks when friends joined us and we got separated. Backwards and forwards he ran, trying to make us see that something was wrong, quite like the child in the melodrama, who, at the end of the play, joins the hands of Mamma and Papa. Dear Luath, he was always that kind of dog. He never probed into the complexities of life. Life to him was a very simple affair. Home, food, games, and a walk out every afternoon. Altogether, what more could you want? Porthos understood better these things, but he was a philosopher. Luath's proper place was the nursery. How happy he would have been if there had been one full of gloriously noisy children. He had the most passionate interest in the workings of nature. I remember once, in the country, the servants had befriended a stray feminine cat expectant of a family. The birth took place in the cook's room, and she and Lewis superintended the affair. For some reason or other, the cook would put the youngsters, as they were born, onto the floor. One by one, he picked them up again and returned them to their mother. He could never bear the kittens out of his sight. I was very glad when they found another home, for he then ceased to haunt the cook's room and became sociable again. Every morning he paid a visit to the gardener's cottage to inquire solicitously after the health of his wife, whose first child was shortly to be born. On the night it arrived, I was awakened by a loud barking. In an instant I was out of my bed and in the corridor, thinking only of burglars. I traced the noise to the bathroom. There stood Lewis, his feet on the windowsill, gazing out towards the cottage, now brilliantly lit up. This was his way of heralding the advent of the man-child. In the morning, he was the first to be shown the baby by the proud mother. He adored young children, and consequently they loved him. They did what they liked with him. And when they overdid it, as very often they did, he came to me and asked me to go to the rescue. I have seen youngsters haul him by the collar, round and round the garden, up and down the paths, until he was nearly dizzy. He never could understand why he got tired of something he loved so well, the simple soul he was. Not but that it is, I confess, one of the wonders of life. With babies, he was quite safe. He knew how to cope with them. To lie quietly on the floor with your eyes tightly shut for fear of their fingers and let them do as they liked with you. You had to put up with it if they found out that you had ears. They were too young to do much mischief with a tail, especially one the size of his. A former maid of mine paid me a visit one day with her firstborn in her arms, and with admirable courage, I thought, placed the babe on the floor beside Lewis. It was not long before the infant had crawled onto the top of him and had the most fascinating time exploring. It soon got its fingers into his mouth, but both the mother and I knew what Lewis was like and left the baby to its fun. It was this maid who very nearly wasn't married at all. It was whilst she was with me, and the marriage feast was to be eaten in the servants' hall, and I was to give the bride away. At the 11th hour, the bridegroom found he was minus some important document, without which the ceremony could not take place, and he had to go down to Clapham or Streatham, or one of those places, and fetch it. We waited in the church for his arrival, the clergyman coming down to the door, prayer book in hand. At 5 minutes to 3, you cannot be married after 3, the bridegroom appeared, panting and perspiring, and then and there the service was begun, and they were joined in holy matrimony as they were going up the aisle. But it was a close shave. And it was this maid who, some months after, made the following inimitable reply to my query as to whether she was not thinking of adding to the population of England. "Oh, ma'am, I wouldn't presume," quoth she, looking down her nose. But as you see, she did presume, with the most excellent result. It must not be supposed for a moment that Lewis was one of those angelic creatures who never give their family any disquieting moments. Far from it. For 2 or 3 of his early years he was nothing short of being possessed of the devil. At all events of a devil. The dance he used to lead me in the Kensington Gardens. We had gone to live facing them before his arrival, and I think he got it into his head that they belonged to us. He was a terror to all the owners of other dogs. As he undoubtedly was the biggest, he generally got the best of any discussion. The elderly ladies with little dogs regarded him with horror, and at his approach clutched their darlings to their bosoms and fled. This, naturally, only excited him the more, and away he went after them. I really think it was merely curiosity. "What are these funny little things?" he cried, and with a tap of his paw, over they went, like skittles. Their yaps and yells and struts appealed to his sense of humour. "Call yourself a dog?" he said, and over it went. "No, no, you can't be," he yelled, and over it went again. In vain I tried to obey the demands of their owners and "Call my dog away, nasty beast!" In vain I tried to get him by the collar. As far as he was concerned, I didn't exist. I explained to them that he was only a youngster, and that he was being funny. Lewis, all the while, prancing about them, awfully happy. They didn't believe me. A dog of that size couldn't be young, and as for his fun, they were in a fury and threatened to have both me and my dog expelled the gardens. I tried hard to train him, with not the slightest result. I put him on the lead, and he dragged me in every direction but the one I wanted to take. There were times when I positively hated him. One morning he was more than usually devilish, and had kept me running after him from one side of the gardens to the other. Every dog he saw in the distance between the trees acted like a magnet. The luncheon hour had come and gone, and still I was trying to make him understand the meaning of the word obey. He would come to within a yard of me and listen attentively to my remarks, but when I put out a hand, he was gone. Once I got so near to him that his only way of escape was the pond, and into it he plunged without a moment's hesitation. Now, dogs are forbidden to go into the round pond, and I had been warned more than once to keep him out of it. Here I was, with a fine of £5 hanging over my head, lunchless, and not the slightest chance of ever getting home again if I waited until he obeyed me. Whilst I was debating whether to leave him to his fate, to disown him, to let him get stolen or run in by the police, a small urchin hove in sight. Seeing my distress, like a gallant knight, he offered his assistance. Off came his boots and stockings, and into the water he went after Lewis, who, taken by surprise, or thinking he was between the devil and the deep sea, decided that it was useless to put up a fight. To, I am sure, the boy's disappointment, allowed himself to be caught and led out of the pond in triumph to me. I need hardly say what I said or did to him, but I had no whip, and a hand is a poor affair with a dog of that size, and more painful to me than to him, and besides, I was dead tired of him. After that, I gave up the struggle, and left him to come home by himself when the fancy took him, the friendly keepers promising to keep an eye on him. But there came a time when I felt he was really more than I could tackle, and that I should have to get rid of him. There is a limit to human endurance, and I had reached it. He must have noticed what was in my mind, for suddenly, as by a miracle, the devil went out of him. That summer, I took a motor tour in France and was away between 6 and 7 weeks. It was the first time I had left him, and, incidentally, my family, for so long, and there's no denying that he simply hated it. Such flattering ways have dogs. By some means he found out the day I was coming back. He lay down in the hall and waited, and waited. About 6 o'clock in the evening, he suddenly sprang to attention, quivering with excitement. He had, from out of the din of the Bayswater Road, heard the toot of the motor horn as the car turned the corner. For all those weeks he had retained the memory of it, although most people would have failed to detect any difference between it and any other. When the door was opened, he flung himself at me. I escaped into the drawing-room, sat down on the floor, and let him do what he liked with me. My hat and veil were torn off, my hair was down my back, my face was wet with his kisses, but not for the world could I have hurt him by uttering one word of protestation. He must get it over. "You have come back again! You have come back again!" he shouted. "I love you! I love you! I will be good! I will! Don't ever go away again!" And he kept his word. The devil had really gone out of him. Being left alone all those weeks, he had employed them in studying cause and effect. He was wicked, I left him. If he were good, I would stay at home. So he decided to be good. Of course, his morality was all wrong. Are we not taught to be good for the sake of goodness? But after all, he had got along the road as far as most of us when he made up his mind to be good for the love of me. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Luath as Nana in Peter Pan. Luath first became famous when his master put him into a play under the name of Nana. As a matter of fact, it was Porthos whom he had in his mind when he wrote the play, for his heart always remained faithful to his first dog. But Porthos could never have made a Nana, whilst Luath was born one. All the delightful domestic duties performed by the stage nurse were exactly the kind of things he would have revelled in, given the opportunity. Perhaps it was not much of a compliment to be turned into a nurse, a lady nurse too, for does she not in the play end in having puppies of her own? Many dogs might have resented it, but no such thoughts tormented Luath. Of all the characters in the world, if he had his choosing, Nana would have been the perfect one for him. His mind could not grasp that there was anything undignified in looking after children. The actor who played the part came to the house to be instructed by Luath how to do it. This took place in the dining room, I remember. He showed him how to walk, to express emotion by the wag of his tail, that is an art of itself, and also by barking. Then there was the beating on the floor with his feet, dancing I called it, when especially pleased, and the jumping onto shoulders, the taking of handkerchiefs and gloves out of pockets, Luath's particular stunt. All these things, and much more, did the actor take note of to help him in the part, with the result we all know. Then, one day, I took him down to Drury Lane, to a place where they specialised in making up men to look like dogs. A sketch was made of him, and a sample taken of his coat. But when it was done, it was very little like the real thing, at least, so I thought, but I may have been prejudiced. He also attended some of the rehearsals, and was a great help to the producers. He sat in the stalls, by the side of the author, and collaborated with him on some of the knotty points. But what he liked best, and so did the children, were the times when the author and the producer were hard at work, each trying to understand what the other meant. Then he would sneak up the little steps that led to the stage and have a good time with the children. These were the titbits that kept both him and them going during a strenuous day. One afternoon he went down to the theatre and saw a part of the real performance. At the end of the nursery scene he took a call, led on by Peter Pan. At first the audience still thought they were looking at the man-dog. When they found out the difference, a mighty shout went up. Luath stood for some moments, wondering what it was all about. Then, thinking it was time he did something in the matter, he lifted up his head and, in a loud voice, asked for an explanation. Happily, at this moment, the curtain fell. After this, he was quite famous in the Kensington Gardens, and the liberties he took unchallenged by the nurses were beyond belief. I have seen him take a bun out of the hand of the baby in the perambulator and eat it. I have seen him pick up the children's toys and run off with them. I have seen him lean over a baby in its nurse's arms and try, mercifully he was stopped in time, to lick its face. We walked about the gardens as though they belonged to him. I was awfully proud of being seen with him. But I must own there were some things he did that he shouldn't have done, on account of the example to the other dogs. One was bathing in the round pond, the keepers looking the other way. You could hardly call it bathing, yet perhaps that is really all it was, for it certainly was not swimming. That he would never do unless compelled. He was really a water dog, as his coat showed. For given 2 or 3 shakes, it was practically dry. But his idea of a perfect bathe was to walk into the water until it was up to his middle. Then he lay down and let the water do the rest. After a few minutes, he got up and walked out again, shaking himself all over any or sundry who might be standing in the way. The children adored this performance, especially in a pond where it was forbidden and under the nose of the keeper, who was there to prevent all adventurous souls doing what they should not, whether they were dogs or humans. His fame was so great that the servants in the neighbourhood took to borrowing him when they were photographed. He made a handsome picture, they said, and gave no trouble. Sat or stood wherever they wanted him, and showed no signs of fatigue or boredom. He really became a professional beauty. It says much for him that his head remained steady under all the adulation. It was about this time that he went through that most annoying phase of insisting on carrying my umbrella. All dogs, I believe, go through it. It's like having the measles, only their owners are the sufferers. At first I rather enjoyed, indeed almost encouraged it, making himself so useful, I thought, and I glowed with pride when the passers-by commented on his cuteness, or the English equivalent of that word. But the feeling of elation soon passed, to be succeeded by one of absolute boredom, for he took to dropping it in the most unlikely places. The other side of the road was the favourite, where he had gone to hold a short parley with another of his kind. But the most aggravating of all was when I had to walk about a couple of 100 yards in the opposite direction to that in which I was going to retrieve it. Never by any chance was he thoughtful enough to drop it near me. At last, in sheer self-defence, I had to leave my umbrella at home and risk getting wet through. My milliner's bill mounted up, I can tell you, during that period. It is very difficult to cure a dog of this bad habit, and it should be checked at the very first sign, for it makes a pleasant walk impossible. Billy got the disease badly. The number of sticks he lost in the woods. Sometimes in the winter he would come across 1 or 2 of them, but generally somebody else had come across them first. Perhaps it's their way of being humorous. It is not easy to know whether a dog is humorous or merely funny. We are sure about his fun, but I wonder about his humour. And yet, sometimes when you are doing a lot of talking and feeling rather pleased with yourself as a wit or a connoisseur of what's what, and you suddenly catch your dog's eyes fixed solemnly on you, you begin to think that there may be something more in him than you have fathomed. You hardly dare call it humour. It's a disconcerting thing, I must own, to catch the eye of anyone who is outside the conversation when you are being particularly brilliant. Lewis could be decidedly funny. He was funny with his master when he came across the garden from his study at dinner time. Every night, when he heard him coming, he hid behind some bushes, and as he passed along, sprung out at him with a loud guffaw. It hardly ever failed to surprise his master, whose mind was still at work in his study. Then they both went mad dog, and scampered about the house, playing hide-and-seek, in and out of the rooms, and as most of the rooms led from one another, a jolly fine time they had. For a quarter of an hour or so, it was a perfect hullabaloo. End of chapter 6.
The Kensington Gardens. It is not possible for everyone to live near the Kensington Gardens, but I cannot help feeling sorry for those whose homes are so far away that they have no chance of giving them more than a passing nod. Surely one of the loveliest places in the whole world, but then I am, as the Americans say, crazy about them. When by any ill fate something keeps me from them for any lengthy period during those flashes of homesickness which come to the most hardened of us, a warmth fills my heart when I think of the Kensington Gardens. The very name is beautiful, so intimate, so full of lovely possibilities, and the many other delicious ones it embraces. The Broad Walk, the Round Pond, the Baby's Walk, the Serpentine, the Flower Walk. There is no Lover's Walk, alas, and there are so many lovers in the gardens, but they make one as they saunter along, and under the trees where they sit, screened discreetly in ecstatic silence. And at one end of the Broad Walk sits the little old woman who sells the littlest balloons. Is it, do you think, because she is too frail to blow them up any bigger, or are they only for the babies? And at the other end stands the largest woman, selling the largest ones. It is of her I buy one when the sun is shining, and I feel I must do something foolish. I sail it on the Round Pond, and with luck, it will cross 2 or 3 times, and there is always the thrill when suddenly it is no longer there, although your eyes have never left it. It has popped itself into nowhere, but there is a more beautiful time even than when the sun shines. At least to me, it is the more beautiful. It is a winter's afternoon, just before the gates are closed. In the gathering darkness, the trees lose themselves in the gray mists. Gradually, the pond, the sky, the trees all mingle together and become one mysterious whole, and you hear, from out of the mists, the sonorous voices of the keepers calling, "All out! All out!" That is the time I love best. Often and often have I heard them, but never without a thrill. The other day, I met a young girl walking down one of the paths, weeping bitterly. I hurriedly chose another and left her to the friendly shelter of the trees. It reminded me of a story I had read of Leonard Merrick's, with the delicious title, "The Apartment Reserved for Those Desirous of Weeping Alone." It is tragic that so few houses have any quiet corner where one can indulge in a good cry, so useful to get rid of bad humors. At the best, one's bedroom is a poor affair. Someone is sure to knock and demand an answer to some inane question. Probably it's only curiosity as to what you are doing in your room with the door locked. I defy you to go back to your good cry after being so disturbed. But a room, an apartment reserved, etc., etc., set apart, and not a soul allowed to go near it except those desirous, etc., etc. But I'm afraid one would not be sufficient. The demand for it would be so great, and there is not much money these days for luxuries, so that Kensington Gardens must still give shelter to those unhappy ones, and we, who may meet them, must considerately pass along by another way. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8. Lua Goes A-Motoring. Nearly all dogs love motoring, so that Lua was not original in his passion for it, but he may differ from the others in this, that he thought all motors belonged to him. I used to take him with me when I went shopping. He found out for himself that shops were places that dogs waited outside of, and was generally to be trusted to be there when I came out. But once or twice, when I had, as he considered, been inside an unusually long time, he took it upon himself to walk in and look for me. On my way down a department, I would come upon a little group of people and see in the middle of it Lua, trying to explain what he was doing there. Shop walkers, saleswomen, as well as the customers, all telling him how charming they thought he was, whilst he craned his neck in every direction to see if he could catch a glimpse of his missus. He greeted my appearance with that embarrassing candor that distinguished him, the whole of the business of the shop being in abeyance until it was finished. But as a rule, he waited for me outside. As I thought, as good as gold. I found out afterwards that he amused himself by stepping into any motor car, occupied or otherwise, that drove up to the door. The commissioner had a busy time with him. I saw him one day step in before the occupant could step out. Now, it is not an easy thing to make a big dog walk backwards, and the lady gave up the struggle and got out by the other side. Another day, I was in time to catch him by the tail and haul him out by it. For the first 2 or 3 times, his exploits were received with affectionate enthusiasm by his victims. "What a darling," they said, in answer to my protestations of remorse. But, of course, it wasn't the thing to encourage, so he had to be chained up with the other pets. All the streets stopped to watch his antics when I came out to release him. Sometimes very embarrassing for me, for as often as not, he would walk away holding the end of my skirt in his mouth. It was of no use to tell him not to. In all probability, he would hit upon something more compromising, so I pretended not to notice. But, after all, it was a very sensible proceeding on his part. He didn't want to lose me again, and he made sure of it by catching hold of me. He always motored with me to the country. Peter Cat as well. Peter sat on my lap, and thought nothing of the journey, be it by train or motor. Lua sat on the seat beside me, his front legs firmly fixed on the floor, his back ones reaching just below the seat. He was gorgeously happy as he sniffed in the air and cast sympathetic glances at all dogs who were merely walking. When his content became unbearable, he turned to me and tried to lick my face, a thing forbidden. After a time, getting thoroughly cramped, he stood up, his head hanging over one side of the car, his tail flung across the other. But he was the happiest dog of all on the return journey, for then he knew that all the delicious scents were leading him to the more entrancing ones of London. The scents of the woods were a poor substitute for the exciting smells of the London streets. There were very few spirit dogs in the woods. In London, he could pass the time of day with them at every lamp-post. A dog seems quite content with this spiritual intercourse. He discovers at the first sniff the sex, age, character of the dogs who have passed along before him, and whom he never sees, and possibly will never see. He knows whether he likes or dislikes them, whether they are good or bad characters. When you come to think of it, dogs meet very few of their own kind. I suppose it is this spirit world they find, as they pass along the street, that keeps them in touch with one another. It is like the daily press, only more trustworthy. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Lua goes to jail. It is a fallacy to think that a dog prefers a country to a town life. They are very much the same as a so-called man about town who prefers his club, his theater, to the gentler delights of the country. Lua wouldn't have remained a minute, I feel sure, in the country given his choice. I will say he made the best of it when there, but it was a mere putting up with it. His family was there, and of course he must be where his family is. But why on earth did we ever want to leave so fascinating a place as London? And I am not sure that the country suited him. Morally, I mean. He was a particularly honest dog in London. Often have I tempted him to a fall by placing the joint on a chair in the dining room and leaving him alone with it. It was a bold thing to do, but he stood the test, and the joint remained untouched. But in the country, he kept us in a state of bewilderment as to where the joints disappeared. Many a time have we been left with a scanty larder over a weekend, and the cottage full of visitors. To give him his due, he never ate them. Rather stupid of him, considering he had stolen them. I think he was so bored in the country, away from the canine excitements that in London greeted him at every corner, that he took up the hobby of collecting joints. Whenever the gardener dug up a piece of ground, he would come across a ham, a sirloin of beef, a chicken, quite untouched. You can see what a time the cook had when she went to put her joint into the oven, to find no joint to put there. If he had only buried them all in one grave, it might have eased the situation. Although people are so prejudiced about eating things that have been in a dog's mouth, even when they know its master intimately, but you see, there they were, spread, you may say, in all directions, and never a clue given as to which part of the garden contained the beef and which the ham or mutton. There is this to be said for him, that his thieving extended over a considerable period. You must not think that it happened every day, or even every week. But you may take it from me that it always occurred at the most inconvenient time for the householder. And there was even a worse incident which took place in the town where I did my shopping. Invariably, he accompanied me in the motor, and was let loose, whilst I was busy, to look about him. He adored those mornings. One day, I saw him, at some little distance from me, suddenly seize a leg of mutton from the window of a butcher's shop and run with it into the road. Frantically, I dashed towards him, yelling terrible things at him. I rescued the mutton and took it back with profuse apologies to the butcher, who, unfortunately, was not the one I dealt with. He was very nice and said it didn't matter and that he couldn't possibly accept any payment for it. As a matter of fact, it didn't matter, for when I passed later, it was again sitting in its old place, looking none the worse for its little adventure. Then, he was always getting himself put into jail. Many a time have I bailed him out, a shilling at a time. Whenever we went away for any time without him, we would, on our return, find him gone, and he was away all night. In the morning, a notification arrived from the police that a dog with that address on his collar had been found loitering about the town, and had been arrested, and on payment of 1 shilling, he would be handed over to us. Of course, I hurried to the police station and bailed him out. We were awfully put out when this first happened. Such a disgrace we felt it to be. But it occurred so often that we became callous and took it as a matter of course. We tried hard to keep him at home, but directly our backs were turned, off he trotted in search of adventure. It was not easy to get out of the garden without manipulating a 6-foot fence of wire netting, put up to keep out the rabbits. And although in his youth he had many times done this, leaving bits of his coat sticking to the top, he was now much too heavy to attempt it. At last, the mystery was solved. He had found out the way to open the big gate. By standing on his hind legs, he was able comfortably to reach the latch. Pulling this down with his paw, he stepped backwards for a little way, pulling the gate with him. When it was open wide enough to allow him to get through, he jumped down and walked out. I have seen him do this after Billy came, only then he opened the gate wide enough for the 2 of them, and they trotted out side by side. It was amusing to watch Billy standing quietly, waiting for Lua to open the gate for him. He never learned how to do it for himself. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Lua Falls in Love. Stevenson writes in his delightful essay, Falling in Love, There is only one event in life which really astonishes a man and startles him out of his profound opinions. Lua was the sorriest example of this. He was now getting on for 8 years. All during them, he had lived the life of a celibate. I don't believe he had ever once thought that another state was possible. He was so interested in the natural affairs of others that he overlooked the fact that he might also have had a share of them. Then, all of a sudden, he fell in love. For a long time, I couldn't conceive what on earth was the matter with him. I guessed every reason but the right one. "After rabbits," I said smilingly, when he disappeared for hours at a time, day after day. But when he began to get thin, to lose his usual dapper appearance, and his coat took on a disheveled, almost mangy condition, I felt it was time something should be done about it. So I flew to the medicine chest, and with pills and powders sought to restore him to his normal state. Poor Lua. Could anything be more unromantic than the amount of physic I poured into him? And yet, nobody would have been more sympathetic if I had only known. At last, he took to staying out until 2 or 3 in the morning. But such was my blundering stupidity, I thought it was to escape his last dose of medicine. Of what I did then, I am almost ashamed to write. My ignorance is my only excuse. When well in the middle of my first sleep, I would be awakened by a gentle yelp from beneath my window. It was Lua, come home. I took not the slightest notice. Another yelp, a little louder. No notice. Again a yelp, this time considerably louder. I tried to sleep. Now came a bark, increasing in volume as time went on, and the door was still closed to him. Of course, sleep was out of the question, and as nobody else in the house heard him, or if they did, had no intention of coming down to let him in, it was up to me to do so. But I had my revenge. As he passed through the hall, I picked up his medicine and poured it down his throat. Perhaps it was not quite playing the game, but what would you have me do? I was exasperated beyond all endurance. And to think that all the time it was love, and for a small spaniel who wouldn't look at him. He used to sit outside her house for hours. I learned afterwards that the mistress of the spaniel was just as much annoyed by his conduct as we were. She could never escape Lua. Wherever she went, accompanied by her dog, he followed. All her doors and gates were kept tightly closed, for he thought nothing of walking into the house. The spaniel set her teeth at him, but he only loved her the more. It was an extraordinary case of misplaced infatuation. At last, when his condition was getting really desperate, the madness went out of him. And in a short time, he was his old sensible self again. A little older, perhaps, a little more subdued, and decidedly with a chastened spirit. Thank heaven he never fell in love again. It was his first and last emotional crisis, which was as well, for his family could not have borne with many of them. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Billy Arrives. It was at this time that my first married life came to an end, and I was living alone at the cottage with Lua. He became dearer to me than ever. He was hardly ever away from me. He slept in my room, he ate with me, he walked with me, he talked with me. I busied myself with my beloved garden. He lay nearby watching. He knew something strange was happening, that things were not as they used to be. A friend living some few miles away, fearing for my loneliness, sympathetically offered to give me a puppy. He was a great lover of dogs and had a fine bobtail, the joy of his life. It was the son of this dog he offered me. I had at first some misgiving about accepting it. There was Lua. What would he have to say about it? He was getting on in life. It was rather like setting up a nursery when well on in middle age. But I risked it. After all, his passion had always been for young things. Now he could have one of his very own to look after. Poor darling. I didn't realize what I was letting him in for. Perhaps of all adorable puppies, the bobtail sheepdog puppy is the most adorable. This one, I named him Billy, went one better than them all. He was a miracle of loveliness. And what a pup, too. The wildest, the most tempestuous ever born. He woke us up. We'd been getting slack. Lua's tail was not wagging as exuberantly as of old. The truth is, we were getting a bit older, and we hadn't found it out until Billy came. He had an exasperating way of making you hear your bones creak. But there he was, 4 months old, and demanding passionately that none of us should be a day older. He was like a hurricane. He bowled us over one by one. The whole household were his slaves. And why? Not because of his virtues, for they were never his strong point, or his beauty, although that was considerable, but because of his power of loving. It blinded you to all his faults and made him irresistible. And he had an engaging way of cocking his absurd head on one side whilst he was listening to you. Of course he went on talking. It was so fascinating to watch him. Lower and lower dropped his head until it was at right angles with his body. Then he righted it, and the game went on all over again on the other side. And, having no tail, he had to resort to other methods to express his feelings. It has often been said, and since I have had one, I also am of the opinion, that the bobtail is more human than his cousins. This carries out my theory about tails, that the further we get away from them, the more difficulty we have in expressing our feelings. A bobtail is more human because he shows what he feels in very much the same way as man. Being still in a natural state, and not able to keep, like man, his emotions bottled up inside him, and having no tail to enable him to let off the steam, he flings his arms around your neck and covers your face with kisses. This is what the passionate, loving Billy did whenever he could catch you unawares. Sammy also, in innumerable little ways, showed his humanness. To me, this is all wrong. I think we make a mistake when we breed dogs minus tails. It's bad for them, and it's bad for us. I don't want a dog to be the least bit human. There are quite enough of us already. I prefer him to be absolutely and entirely doggy. I wouldn't alter a bit of him. Let humans keep to their own inferior humanness, to their reserves, their clevernesses. But for goodness sake, let us leave our dogs to express themselves in their own natural, spontaneous way. Let them remain helplessly themselves. And think of the advantages of a dog with a tail. He can lie at his ease and, without the disturbing of an eyelid, give an instantaneous response to any remark you may address to him. On the other hand, he without a tail has to rise before he can express anything, and then he wags the whole of him at once. There's no subtlety in it, and it's clumsy to say the best for it. But in the meantime, I must admit that there is something about him that no other dog possesses. His affection, his intelligence, his agility, his abundant charm place him in the front rank of dogs. Lua and Billy made an extraordinary-looking pair. The black and white Lua always so spick and span, not a hair out of place. A real Bond Street swell, in fact. Billy, shapeless, and one might almost say faceless. From his rump to the tip of his nose, a solid mass of long, flowing, untidy, pale gray fur. As he grew up, he looked more and more an exaggerated puppy, and his eyes, of the Irish type, put in with an unusually smutty finger, entirely disappeared under a shock of hair. After the dignity of Porthos and Lua, the scatterbrains of Billy were a bit disturbing. He was a prodigious swaggerer, too. When one day he was making himself a more than ordinary nuisance, and I was trying to put the fear of God into him, Lua fixed me with a solemn eye, as though to say, "Why take any notice?" Why indeed? Why take any notice of anything that people do to annoy you? A very sound philosophy, if we all practiced it, and it might be the beginning of a new Christian era. But in the meantime, a good sound thrashing was what Billy was wanting, and got. Lua was never jealous of Billy. He might well have been. Billy was not one of those who hide their virtues under a bushel. Not only his virtues, but his vices he blazoned out before the whole world. Everything he did with passion. It seemed useless to correct a dog who could hardly wait for it to be over before he sprang upon you and embraced you wildly. He hadn't the slightest respect for Lua's years. He treated him in a jocular way. "Hello, old thing," you could almost hear him say. "Buck up." He couldn't understand why I should make any fuss of Lua. "That old thing." They often had scraps, for Lua refused to be bullied by him. Billy was always careful when it came to that, for he knew he had no chance when Lua's temper got thoroughly aroused. Porthos was the only one who was not a fighter. Lua, in spite of his domesticity, or perhaps because of it, dearly loved telling a smaller dog what he thought of him. And as there were seldom any bigger ones, he was pretty safe to have his own way. But Billy was a born fighter. He really loved it. And after he was married, but we will come to that later on. He was wicked in quite a different way from the others. They were wicked because they couldn't help it. They were just puppies. But Billy loved being wicked. He took a positive delight in it. And like a true sport, didn't in the least mind what he paid for it. It was worth it. He was with us a little more than 2 years, and I can tell you, a mightily exciting 2 years he managed to make of them. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Some Garden Pets. About this time, the garden was peopled with various odds and ends in the way of pets. The most important was the heron, who, fancying the goldfish swimming about in the little pond, took upon himself to descend when he was promptly captured by the gardener, who made him one of the family by clipping his wings. Unfortunately, we had not reckoned with his propensity for fishing, with the result that in the morning very few of the goldfish were left. The others had provided him with a tasty breakfast. Some wire netting was hastily put over the remainder, much to his annoyance. He stood on one leg and sadly watched them. I could just imagine the fun he had had with them, for I saw him one day with a toad. A cat, in comparison, is quite kind to the mouse he plays with. The heron threw it up and down, hither and thither, until he and the toad were tired. Then he dipped it into the water and swallowed it whole. He would follow the garden boy about for hours, waiting for him to dig one up. Frogs he couldn't abide. It was fascinating to watch his food moving down his long neck in easy stages. He was fed with fish and pieces of meat, and was extremely greedy. Indeed, his greediness was his undoing, and brought about his untimely end, for he choked himself. But that was after he had been with us for about a year. He had the walk of a tragedian of the old school, and adored looking at himself in a mirror. You might often see him pecking away at his reflection in the window, which seemed to give him little pleasure. At breakfast, he came into the dining room and sat on the back of a chair and took a lively interest in all that was going on. He became so friendly that at the sound of my voice, he would come running down to the house to greet me. At night, he slept in a tree, as high as his clipped wings would take him. Then there was the tortoise, by name Araminta, although we had no earthly reason to infer it was a female. He, or she, was a perpetual source of curiosity to Lua, who could never understand how she, we'll call her she for short, worked. He was continually turning her over and over on her back for examination. We were always having to put her on her feet again. Araminta was tied to the cherry tree in the middle of the lawn by a string put through a hole in her shell. This string was so long that she could take a walk into the woods and not come to the end of it. Every evening there was a tortoise hunt. Yard by yard we followed the string, round and round the trees and bushes, and amazingly intricate it sometimes was, until we ran Araminta to earth. There was much rivalry as to who would be the first to find her, and it was nearly always Lua. Long after the tortoise was dead and gone, and we were living elsewhere, at the word Araminta, Lua was on his feet, trembling with excitement. Some lizards lived in the rock garden, but they never got really friendly, and although they went by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, we were never intimate enough to know which was which. In Sicily, on the contrary, they became very pally and played about my feet. One day, two young ones had a fight. They were exactly like two little boys, attacking, parting, and attacking again. At last, one of them got the other by the neck and bit him so viciously that I had to go to the rescue, and by stamping my foot separated them. But at once they were at it again, with renewed vigor. Suddenly they flew apart and ran in different directions. I looked round and saw Mama Lizard hurrying to the scene of action, ready, I expect, to give them a good spanking. And frogs, I found, when you got to know them, were quite nice little beasts, and extremely sociable. They came into the sitting room in the evening and played leapfrog over the dogs. On going to bed, I picked them up with a shovel, for I never could abide the clammy feel of them, and took them back to their homes under the lavender bushes. But you should have seen the fun they had with me on the way, using the shovel as a diving board. End of Chapter 12.
Chapter 13. Lueth finds a pheasant. It seemed a waste to live in the middle of woods, alive with rabbits and pheasants, etc., with two dogs, who were no earthly good at catching anything. A pheasant or two would have made a pleasant addition to the larder, but although they spent hours running fiercely in and out of the bracken, the result was practically nil. I say practically, for once Lueth found a pheasant. Found is not a good sporting word, I believe, but it is the only word that describes what happened that morning. One moment he was walking quite quietly 50 yards ahead of me, and the next he was running rapidly away with a pheasant in his mouth. He had picked up a sitting hen. There, by the side of the path, were the eggs, still quite warm. I hurried as fast as my legs would carry me after him, but long before I reached him, he came walking towards me, looking very self-conscious. But the pheasant was gone. I could see that he had been up to something, and knowing his propensity for burying things, I looked about me. My suspicions proved correct. There, sticking out of the pine needles, was the end of a feather. Thinking it better at any rate to recover the corpse, I began to dig away the peat with my stick. Suddenly out flew, with a loud squeak, the pheasant. Unhurt, not a feather displaced. Lueth watched all this with a puzzled, interested look on his face. What idea he had in his head when he buried it? I cannot think. To treat a live pheasant in the same way that he treated a ham, was, to say the least of it, foolish as well as cruel, and Luath was neither. I think the bird must have pretended she was dead, just as the rabbit did, the only live one he caught. That was when Billy put it up, and ran round and round it in a circle until Luath went to the rescue, and brought the rabbit down to me. I examined it carefully and pronounced it dead, and hung the carcass high up in a tree so that we might retrieve it on the way back. It would be a nice little titbit for their suppers. But when we returned, there was no rabbit to be seen, either on the tree or on the ground, notwithstanding that the dogs had made a thorough search, so I presumed it had sham death. 2 or 3 times Luath was heard screaming hysterically in the distance, and when found, had got hold of a rabbit, but unluckily a trap had also got hold of it. I released the poor thing, and gave it a sporting chance for its life, and I must say, it took it bravely. Another time he found a dead one, and carried it to the Black Lake, and buried it in the water. To his annoyance, it bobbed up again. He spent a harassing time burying that dead rabbit, and at last got the body under some weeds, where it mercifully stayed. Like many sportsmen, they had lovely times, with their noses close to the ground, following the alluring scent of something or other they never by any chance saw. Anyhow, they were saved the problem of wondering what to do with it, when caught at least. Luath was, for burying it alive is pretty poor sport. I remember once in Scotland a friend stayed with us who spent day after day dressed in a wonderful fishing costume, wading in the river, a long fishing rod in his hand, leaping from stone to stone as happy as a king, whilst my poor cook was trying to keep his meals hot for him. He never caught one fish, but what did that matter? He was fishing, and that was enough. So it was with the dogs. They hunted and wished for nothing more. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Billy comes to London. The time came when I was compelled to sell my cottage. This was about a year after my second marriage. We were poor and needed the money that the sale of it would bring in. My heart ached at the thought of leaving my beloved garden. I had made every bit of it. It was my child, created out of and by me. Creation in some form or other must go on, even if one is unable to create life. One must turn to and create something else. So I had created my garden. I had watched the cottage grow as well as the garden. A wing on this side, another on that, a wall down here, a window thrown out there. Both cottage and garden were part of me, and I loved every stone, every plant. I think I even loved what the gardener called the garden pests. I had the same feeling about the cottage and garden that I had about Porthos. He had been my first dog. He had had a bit of me that neither of the others could ever have. That first time, what a wonderful thing it is. No second can ever have the same glamour, be it ever so fine. A melancholy truth, but one there is no getting away from. My heart sickened at the thought of having to say goodbye to all the places I loved so well. To the woods, to the hills at the back of the house, up which the pine trees marched so gallantly, grouping themselves at the summit into the aisles and chancel of a stately cathedral. When the moon was at full, the shadows of the trees were so sharply silhouetted that trees and shadows were scarcely distinguishable one from the other, and the river, the little wandering stream that meandered through the woods, ever and again hiding itself under the flowering trees that grew alongside it. It went so gently on, lingering for a moment to leave a pool behind as it peacefully flowed away. It was in one of these pools that the dogs bathed. On one side of it rose a high bank, and from there Billy made his famous plunge. Long before he reached the spot, he took the run and leapt down without even stopping to give a glance. Luath carefully picked his way down the bank as befitted his years and weight, and walked in to be scoffed at by Billy. How scornful Billy was of anyone who failed to reach his level. I must say this, that few did, but he might have been more modest about it. And then there was the Black Lake and the herons. They built their nests on the top of the highest trees. For hours they sat at the water's edge, waiting patiently for the fish to rise. One day Luath found a baby one, sitting alone on a tiny island. It was too young to fly away. I held it in my hands. Quite a big thing, although so helpless. It gripped hold of my fingers with its claws. Its neck was so long and out of all proportion to the rest of him. A fully grown neck and baby body and legs. We put the young queer thing back onto the island. Perhaps the father had left him there to learn fishing and patience. The bracken grew so high in these woods that when you lay it down amongst it and peered underneath it, it was like gazing at another world. How beautiful it all was. My soul went cold at the thought of giving it up, but it had to be. A purchaser very soon appeared, and in a short time we were back in London. Billy was now 18 months old, and in the prime of life as far as his youthful impetuosity was concerned. He hadn't been there many minutes before he knew more about it than Luath, who had lived there most of his life. From the first he started with the firm idea that he was London. He had not come to it, he had brought it with him. That, you see, was the kind of dog he was. Every time he was taken out for a walk, he bounded out of the house with a wild yell, and seizing Luath by the loose flesh that hung beneath his jaw, walked for several hundred yards down the street in this fashion. In vain did Luath try to make him see that one didn't do these things in London. No amount of reasoning had the slightest effect on Billy. The passers-by thought it was a case of cruelty to animals by animals. They condoled with Luath and feared he was suffering, but poor darling he wasn't, only feeling dreadfully embarrassed. Personally, I had no objection to this idiosyncrasy on Billy's part, for it kept him out of the temptations that always pursue dogs when out for a quiet walk. To get to the Kensington Gardens from where we now lived, we had to walk the length of the Kensington High Street. To pilot two dogs safely through the crowds of shop gazers that frequent that popular thoroughfare was as difficult as steering a ship into a crowded harbour. They were always getting lost. So busy with their own affairs they forgot all about me. Then suddenly missing me, they concluded that the best thing to do was to sit down and wait at the spot where they had last seen me. At first this worried me dreadfully, but after a bit I took it more calmly and left them to look after themselves. In the end they always came home, barking fiercely for the door to be opened to them. They would sit outside a shop for the best part of an hour, quite close together, with eyes fixed gloomily on the door. Then I expected Billy, getting a bit fidgety, and a sinking feeling in his tummy, warning him it was dinner time, says to Luath, "What do you think, old man? Any good staying any longer?" "I'll take a look inside and see if she's there," replies Luath. He returns, shaking his head. "Not a sign of her. We'd better go home. I'm feeling peckish." "Me too," says Billy, and away they trot side by side. And when they reach the house, bark their worst until the door is open to them. Luath was now getting to that time of life when it was necessary to go slowly and comfortably. Slowly he certainly went, as the taximen, bus drivers and others can vouch for. It was an impressive sight to watch him hold up the traffic at the busiest times of the day while he sauntered leisurely across the road, the drivers, according to their individual sense of humour, either cursing or laughing. He paid not the slightest attention to the shouts of the men, even if he heard them, which I doubt. He was so lost in contemplation, he never for a moment dreamed they were directed at him. This was the first time Billy had been in the Kensington Gardens, and it was an agitating moment for both Luath and me, supposing he didn't like them. But perish the thought. He must, that is, if he were the dog we thought he was. As we entered the gate, I clutched Luath by the collar. It steadied the nerves of both of us. At first, Billy took it all very unconcernedly, sniffed at the grass, and compared it, unfavourably I feel, sure, with what he had just left behind him in the country. But when he got to the broad walk and caught a whiff of the round pond, he began to show excitement. When he saw it, he was off before I could utter a cry of warning. What cared he about any regulations? He plunged into the pond under the very nose of the keeper. Luath cocked an eye at me with a smile. All was well with our beloved gardens. Billy approved of them. However, we thought it wisest to keep at a distance and pretend he didn't belong to us, for there was no knowing what he might be up to next. Soon a crowd of little boys were grouped around him. He had won their hearts by rescuing their lost boats. They threw a stone and he brought out a boat. I often wondered whose boat. The keepers hadn't the heart to interfere, and seeing that all was going well, Luath joined him and indulged in a little of his own special brand of bathing. But he would never have thought of this ingenious way of evading the rules and regulations of the round pond. But I had to be very firm with Billy about the sheep. He had never seen one before, and to be suddenly confronted with a whole drove of them would have been a temptation to the most serious-minded dog. After all, what can you expect of one whose ancestors have been trained to keep sheep in order for centuries? At first he stood stock still, amazed at the sight of such a number of dirty, woolly-coated creatures. They, in their turn, probably thinking he was some kind of odd sheep, formed themselves in a semicircle around him. Billy stood there, spellbound, and all, I think, would have been well, if one of those silly things had not started running. That was too much. With a shout he was in the middle of them, scattering them in all directions. Whether he had any inherited idea of what he was doing, I know not. But when, eventually tired out, he returned to me, we had a heart-to-heart chat about it all, and I tried to convince him that London sheep were to be respected, and they needed no more exercise than what they got wandering about eating the grass and keeping it a pleasurable length for us to walk upon. Taken all in all, I think the Serpentine is the place most beloved by dogs. So long as they don't come into collision with the waterfowl, they can do practically what they like. And what mine liked was to be in and out of the water, the whole length of it. And when out, it was only to play the mad dog game on the stretch of grass that ran alongside it. A sudden renewal of youth came to Luath when he reached this spot. It was as though he stepped out of many years as he went under the bridge, to put them on again on the way back. He was not nearly so alert as he used to be, and twice managed to get stolen, each time from the Kensington Gardens. On the first occasion, he was away 2 days and 1 night. All the police stations were notified, and everything possible was done to get some information of him, but in vain. In the evening of the second day, a rough-looking character called at the house, and said a dog with that address on his collar had followed him home, and what was I prepared to do in the matter? I was prepared to give him my last $1, but I got him for less than that. I accompanied the man to a dirty slum in Nottingdale, and in a filthy yard at the back of a still filthier house, I found Luath. The police, who were greatly annoyed that I had not let them deal with the matter, said that this was a well-known quarter for dog thieves. On the next occasion, he was away for 2 days and 2 nights, and I began to feel very doubtful that I should ever see him again, when a policeman called saying a telephone message had been received at the Kensington police station, to the effect that a dog corresponding to the description of Luath was at Regent's Park. I must tell you that it had been freezing weather, and heavy snow lay on the ground, but I was not prepared to find him in such a deplorable condition, starving and dejected and shivering. But in spite of it, he managed to express so much joy at the sight of me that the policeman almost wept. I got him home and dosed him with aspirin, and by the morning he was almost himself again. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Billy is married. We had never given a thought to marrying either Porthos or Luath. Porthos was such an unmistakable bachelor that a wife in connection with him was unthinkable. But Luath was a born parent. He should have fathered, since he couldn't be a mother, numerous fine families. Given a wife who could have borne with his excessive domesticity, he would have been extremely happy, and at the end of his life, I see no reason why he shouldn't have headed the poll as a claimant for the Dunmow Flitch. But of course, it would have depended entirely on his wife. One of the modern kind would have been the ruin of him. So taking all the risks into consideration, perhaps he was better off as he was. But with Billy, it was quite another thing. You might as well try to stop the incoming tide as prevent romantic adventures arriving to Billy. He was not a passionate nature for nothing. So we took the matter in hand and looked around for a suitable bride, thinking that perhaps marriage would have a steadying effect on him. At all events, it is best to begin respectably. In course of time, you might, if you had been looking, have seen a notice in the Morning Post that a marriage has been arranged, etc., etc. The lady was called Betty, and I need hardly say was a beautiful young creature of birth and breeding. She lived in Regent's Park. One afternoon, Billy was taken over to be introduced to her. He behaved disgracefully and refused to look at her, preferring his family. But she had fallen in love with him at first sight, so we put our money, as the racing people say, on her, and married them then and there. A tea party took place in the drawing room, and the health of the happy pair was drunk in a dish of tea. He was left with his bride to spend the honeymoon, whilst I went back to break the news to Luath. His thoughts at once flew to the future, and he saw himself surrounded by a large family of grandchildren. He quite forgot, as we all mercifully forgot, what we endured when Billy was a pup. How he made us both feel so aged. Heaven only knows what his son might do to us, but Luath was always an optimist. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Billy has to go. We were now once more living in the country, but a country very different from the pine woods amongst which we were before. Here there were commons, and wheat fields, and beech woods, where the loveliest wild flowers grew. Indeed, all the flowers I had known in my garden were now growing at my feet under the beech trees, and in the fields, and along the hedges. It was as though nature had found this part of the world so desirable that she had made grow all the flowers she loved the best. It was nearly 700 feet up, and the hills ran from one to the other, and villages nestled amongst them. But none was so beautiful as the one on which we lived. It was a perfect place for dogs, plenty of their peculiar kind of sport in the woods. A good long stretch of common at the very door, where they could come to no harm, and, best of all, lots of little ponds in which they might bathe. And in every wood and through every field we were allowed to walk unmolested. Nowhere did we meet that offensive warning, trespassers will be prosecuted. I have never known a place where there were so many rights of way. One went through my paddock, and without thinking, I shifted the stile a few yards down. It was more convenient for me that way, and really was better for those using it. I had the whole village about my ears. They pulled the stile down during the night, and also the fence that replaced it. It was perfectly unreasonable, but nothing could be done. So I had ignominiously to put it all back as it was before. And just because 2 or 3 men used it to save a few yards when they went to the inn for their beer. There was always a heated argument going on between them and the lord of the manor about the rights of the common. They declared that there was not enough room for their cows and sheep and goats and pigs, etc., and demanded that the gorse should be cut down. He refused so to maltreat his beautiful common. It ended in the villagers taking the law into their own hands and setting fire to it. The whole countryside turned out to see the fun, as they called it. Everybody except the lord of the manor. And in order that he should not miss all of it, they put up a blaze outside his very gates. They had an original way of their own of dealing with a moral offender. A man on the common had been found guilty of misdemeanour against his wife. Some girl was mentioned in the manor, who lived in a neighbouring village. One night all the men turned up outside his house, armed with every sort of thing that is capable of producing a horrible din, such as tin kettles and saucepans, and proceeded to beat them under his windows, to let him know what they thought of his conduct. They were a hard-working lot, mostly small farmers, and apart from the matter of the style, I found them neighbourly and obliging. The innkeeper found it very hard to make a living, for most of them made their own drink, and every spring and autumn a heavy brewing went on. Dandelion wine was the favourite, and they drank it like beer. Blackberry and elderberry they looked upon as only fit for women. The wine was rather intoxicating to those who were not accustomed to it, and once or twice my visitors, for I went in heavily for making it, had to retire to sleep it off. Now I don't want to say a word against matrimony in these pages, but there is no doubt about it, that it was not a success as far as Billy was concerned. He was never the same dog afterwards. His temper became uncertain and decidedly hasty. The sight of another dog made him fierce, and with the aid of Luath, who in spite of his years was quite game for a fight, when there was another to back him up, there was many a sharp tussle with the other dogs scattered about the common. It soon became evident that Billy was not popular, either with the dogs or their owners. I think he felt this and resented it. It is hard lines on a dog who has been much admired, and incidentally has much admired himself, to find that instead of admiration, he gets nothing but abuse. He grew more and more exacting. All your attention must be for him. Poor old Luath was continually being pushed on one side. If you have anything to give away, such as a pat on the back or a good dog, said Billy, well, here I am. Who is there more worthy to receive it? Peter Cat was the only one who kept Billy in his place, and who treated him as a mere dog. Many a sharp slap did he get from Peter's claws. This is not the Peter of the beginning of the book. That one was found dead under the yew hedge. The new one was a blue Persian, and had a fierce spirit, and was a rare sport with mice and rats and birds. In the field behind mine was a pheasant tree. This was before the war, and the farmers still bred pheasants. When I saw them first, walking about so happily with their young ones, a fear took possession of me that perhaps Peter had also cast an eye on them. A high wire fence protected them, but I knew that it would be of little use to keep Peter out if he desired to get in. I kept an anxious eye on him for some time, and was pleased to find no signs of wickedness. But one day I happened to look behind some boards that the workmen had placed against the fence. A horrid sight greeted my eyes. A number of half-eaten birds, and amongst them the remains of what might have been a nice plump pheasant. I was extremely disturbed, for I had no wish to have my beautiful Peter come within range of the farmer's gun. The next day I waylaid the farmer, and after admiring the appearance of his pheasants, I said I hoped my cat would not be tempted to go near them. He replied that he had never seen him there. "Don't you think," I asked, "that it would be a good thing to frighten him from going near them? If you were to give him a beating close to the fence, I feel sure it would stop any such desire on his part." The farmer demurred at this. Why should he beat a cat for no reason? But I urged him, and at last he consented. Peter was found and put into his hands, and carried across the fields. A heavy slap, and he was tearing for dear life, in search of a hiding place. Never had he suffered such an indignity from the hands of a stranger. Before or after fall, it completely cured him of his taste for pheasants. As time went on, Billy became more and more quarrelsome, and such was his reputation that old women and children would hurriedly turn their back and fly when they saw him coming. It wasn't all his fault. The other dogs had most offensive manners. It was difficult to keep even Sammy from telling them what he thought of them, and he was the most good-tempered dog. But Billy had got a bad name, and give a dog a bad name, there is very little hope for him. He could do nothing right, and when he bit his mistress, well, they said, if he can bite her, he can bite anyone. But this was not true. He might dislike dogs, but with people he was always on the best of terms. His biting of me was quite an accident. It happened in this way. He had not been behaving particularly well on the common, probably fighting, but I forget what, and had been promised a beating. Not so much for that, but for refusing to come to me when he was called. I was giving it him inside the gate, when Luath walked in, and accidentally brushed against him. That was enough. He sprang up on Luath, who retaliated, and there was a terrific set-to. I tried to pull Luath off by his collar, at the same time that Billy flew at his neck, and caught my hand instead. I gave a yell, and at once the fight was over, both the culprits sneaking away crestfallen, the first time they had ever hurt their missus. Poor Billy was abject, and sat with gleaming eyes whilst first aid was being given to the wound. You can imagine the scandal that this meant all round the village. I could hardly show my face outside the door. I began to feel they hated both me and my dogs, but we brazened it out until one day I was met on my return from a visit to London by the servants with an awful tale of a fight between Luath and Billy and a sheepdog belonging to the farmer nearby. The sheepdog, they declared, was half killed. I went round in the morning and interviewed the farmer, who was almost speechless with anger. My darter that fond of the dog, he kept on saying, and he's so good with the sheep and now he can't bark no more. I had a look at the dog tied up in a kennel in the field. I found him pretty bad and very dirty and unkempt. Nothing had been done to him. His darter had not even had the thought to bathe him. I went home and got some rags and boracic, and with some warm water I set to work to clean his wounds. After that he picked up a bit and tried to tell me what he thought about it. It was not long before he was well again, but I am afraid his bark was very little use when arguing with sheep. But this meant the end of Billy as far as I was concerned. I had to live in the village, and it would be impossible to do it pleasantly if all this ill feeling continued. So I finally decided to find him another home. Fortunately, I heard of one in the Midlands, where there was every chance of his being happy and well cared for, and here he was sent. But it was an unhappy business, and it took us some time to get used to the quietude that settled upon us after he had gone. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17. The Coming of Sammy. The result of Billy's union with Betty had been a litter of 6 puppies, and 2 of them, Sammy and Biddy, were sent down to me. Biddy I gave to the policeman who lived on the common. Nature must have forgotten what she intended when she created Sammy and Biddy, and reversed the sexes, for Sammy should have been Biddy, and Biddy, Sammy. She was almost all male, and he female. She had the same wild, tempestuous, passionate nature as her father, and except that she was smaller, was the exact replica of him. Sammy's coat was a darkish blue-grey, and much straighter than Billy's. His fine grey eyes were almost entirely hidden under the shock of hair that fell over them. He was a delicious pup, full of gentle humour, but lacking the vitality of any of the others. He loved being funny. I was always being funny with him. Every afternoon, the following little scene was enacted in my sitting room. I would be lying down on the sofa, when suddenly he threw himself across my lap. "Let's be funny," his eyes asked. I pretended not to understand, and went on with whatever I was doing at the moment. Then a blow from his large soft paws, and away went my work, or my book, and if it were the newspaper, which he mightily preferred, he flung himself into the middle of it. Being funny consisted of playing with anything that might be handy, his collar being the favourite. Both he and Billy always wore bright green ones, which went very nicely with the complexion of both. He would stand quite still, hardly breathing whilst I undid it. Then we both went mad dog together. When he was exhausted, I need hardly speak of my condition. I returned to my sofa. "Snoozle," I said, and at once his head was buried in my lap. He slept in the room that led out of mine, on an armchair covered with a sheet to keep it clean, and you can imagine what he did with that sheet when he went to bed. In the end, he was so mixed up in it that he rolled over and over on the floor, trying to find his legs. The sheet lasted him all his life, alas so short, but there was very little left of it at the end. He had a curious way of coming to my bedside during the night and looking at me. Being a light sleeper, I would wake knowing he was there. "Sammy," I called, and put out my hand to feel his soft muzzle pressed against it. Then he would go back quietly to his chair. Luath always lay outside the door and leant against it so hard that often it burst open and he would amble in, very softly, hoping I didn't hear. Sometimes I pretended I didn't, but the door burst open so frequently he had found out the knack of it that at last I had to get it repaired, and forever after he lay peacefully outside. It was very jolly having 4 dogs to go a-walking with, for it was some months after Semi's arrival, before Billy went. Biddy was always waiting in the garden of the police station and would leap over the fence when she caught sight of us. During one of our walks, the dog put up a kangaroo and chased him until he jumped down a ravine. Now, I don't wish for a moment that you should think that kangaroos were common about here, but it happened that the owner of that particular wood was a collector of curiosities, and there was no knowing, if you had any luck, what strange beast you might come across. It was in this wood, too, that Billy was swallowed up by a bog. Happily, it disgorged him again, but decidedly the worse for colour, and it took all the ponds on the way home to restore him to his own delicate shade of grey. Luath was now getting quite an elderly gentleman. I don't think he ever gave a thought to the rabbits after Billy went. He was too old to hunt by himself, and he got no encouragement from Sammy, who wasn't the least bit a sportsman. He had for Sammy the affection and tolerance that the old have for their grandchildren, and after Billy's departure, Sammy absolutely depended on him. He trotted close by his side, smelling the same smells, and finding interest in the same unexciting adventures. I am afraid the humour of dogs does not reach a very high level, but I think in Sammy it sounded its lowest. It seems impossible that man or beast can regard those unfortunates who have lost the elasticity of youth as comics. But to Sammy, the inability of Luath to manipulate the styles was the funniest thing. Just as in a play, somebody falling into a bandbox never fails to bring down the house, so the sight of Luath, standing wondering which foot to put first, sent Sammy off into fits of hilarity. At every style he waited for this performance. Luath took to lagging behind, knowing what awaited him. He searched the hedges for a gap big enough to let him through, but it was of no use. Sammy was always there to receive him. Generally he had to be hoisted over, and by pushing and pulling he eventually landed on the other side, to be greeted with the inhuman guffaws of Sammy, and to think that once he had been as agile as any of them, and that he thought nothing of climbing a fence of 6 feet. He had grown old so gradually that one hardly noticed it. His figure and coat were still as handsome as ever. Not long before he died, one of the village children came to beg for his company, and a wandering photographer took them on the common. His eyes had become sad, and he followed me wherever I went. I was always tumbling over him, but he never minded. But I do wish he had not taken a fancy to lying on the flower beds. There was one he was particularly fond of, and many a prized plant he flattened out. It was no use trying to make him understand that he was doing something grossly abnormal. All the knowledge that had served him so admirably during his life, basely, deserted his old age. The pale green of the tender Lilium aurotum touched a warm place in his heart. He wanted to lie close to them. He had given up walking on his hinder legs. He had taken instead to lying on Mother Earth, and it was not his fault that my especial pet plants happened to be in the way. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Something about Biddy. There are always some things in life that stand out so vividly that when you think of them, your heart beats more quickly. And they are not necessarily the big things. Those mornings on the common are an instance of this. Although they occurred every day seemed different. A hedge a mile long of pink and white hawthorn ran along the bottom of the common, and by the side of it was a walk, where, even on the sharpest day, you could find shelter and warmth. It was here that Sammy and Biddy ran races, whilst Luath and I followed more sedately. Then we would come to a spot I called the parlour. It was surrounded by green bushes, and we would sit there unseen by the passers-by. Often I took brush and comb and groomed the dogs, and many a bush has bunches of Luath's hair concealed at its root. It was so lovely lying there in the sun. The larks overhead, the plovers in the field across the hedge, and the cuckoo in the distance. Sammy, tired after his games with Biddy, buried himself in the heather, and Luath, conscious also of the glory of the morning, would roll on his back and kick up his legs and dream he was a youngster again. And then the war came, and the common was turned into a battlefield, and hundreds of men came there to learn how to fight. Behind the gorse bushes were soldiers with guns. One army was always in retreat. I need hardly say which one. I was so sorry for those who impersonated the enemy. They were continually in retreat, and looked so thoroughly ashamed of the whole business, of having, in plain English, to run away. The dog, seeing men behind bushes busy potting the enemy, naturally barked at them and gave the whole thing away. There was a windmill at the end of my garden in which the sitting rooms were. It was surrounded by a courtyard, and all around this the soldiers fought. Sometimes it was at night, and then very late one would hear their muffled tread passing the house. So quietly they went over the grass, and it was only as they crossed the road that one heard them at all. Down the zigzag path, up again on the other side, and onto the village, where the fight was to begin. In the morning we had to pass between two lines of men, lying on their stomachs, with guns ready to shoot. And farther on we came across the enemy, crawling up the hill to meet them. Poor Sammy, what he suffered. He hated all the noise, and the guns were going off at all hours of the day, and sometimes at night. He never got used to it. At the first sound of a gun, he would come and hide his head in my skirts. He felt that if he didn't see it, it would be easier to bear. Only once was he in London after he left it at 3 months, and then I thought he would have died of it. The noise of the traffic bewildered him, and the electric trains terrified him out of his senses. What the others found exciting and amusing, he only found alarming. I had one terrible tussle with him, and it was more painful to me than anything I had experienced with either of the other dogs. He had chased a cow in the field below the garden, and as she was in calf, it was a serious business. It resulted in her miscarriage, and I was quite rightly called upon by the farmer to pay the costs. The next time I went through the field with him, I took the precaution to catch hold of his collar. I suppose it was the first time that he had ever been walked that way. A collar to him was merely a thing to play with. He would have none of it. Up and down he went, wiggling and twisting, and doing everything but walk. It was a fight between him and me, and I meant to be the victor. But he resisted stubbornly, and the only way I could get him along at all was by hitting his back legs sufficiently hard to make him move them. For a mile we proceeded in this manner, and by the time we had reached the house I was visiting, we were both in a state of exhaustion. He lay perfectly still all the evening, would eat nothing, would do nothing. We went home by the road, and he ran free, still very subdued. The next morning, during the usual walk on the common, I thought I would see what he would do on again, taking him by the collar. Like a lamb he suffered it, and never again gave me the slightest trouble. It is difficult to imagine that anything so gentle as Sammy could have been fathered by so wild a spirit as Billy. Billy, who never thought that anyone but himself could do anything, and even when he was passionately loving you, see if you can do it as well as that. We have all known that person who, seated comfortably, says, "Let me do that for you," and never budges from his chair, but does it so charmingly that you say of him, "What a dear thing," although another and harsher word would be more appropriate. I am sure Billy would have been that kind of man. It's a curious thing, but I don't like feminine animals. Female dogs and cats I simply can't abide. To tell the truth, I can hardly stay in the room if one is there. And if they try to fuss with me, to lick me, it really makes me feel sick. It is their sexiness, I think, that does it. They seem so full of it. It oozes out from every part of them, all over them, as a matter of fact. Betty was different in this respect. She was mostly male, the image of her father. She adored Sammy, but in a clean, decent, honest, friendly way. There was no sentimental silliness about it. Of course she oughtn't to have adored him at all, not in that way. But how was she to know? What is blood relationship to a dog? There it was. Sammy was the one dog for her. I must say he gave her no encouragement. To him she was simply something to play with, just as he played with his collar, or a cushion, or a newspaper. He lumped them all together, and put her, as he put them, out of his mind entirely until the next play hour came round. But Betty was a wild, passionate thing, and had a will of her own, so that when her master, with an idea of breeding good pups, found a mate for her in a fine bobtail from a neighbouring village, she would have nothing to say to him. I had been away with Sammy for some time, and on my return I was told, as a great secret, of the awful affair of Biddy. It appears she had consorted with some mongrel terrier loitering about the common, and 5 puppies were the result. It was as though she had said, "If I can't have Sammy, I don't care what I do." Poor Biddy. She was locked up in a shed with 1 puppy. The others had all died of her neglect, but locks and bolts were insufficient to keep her from coming to see Sammy. Directly she knew he was home again, there she was as usual, a broken chain hanging from her collar. Her master was so inexpressibly shocked and ashamed at this wanton behaviour on the part of his much-prized dog that his one idea was to keep it dark. Not a soul in the village must know of it, but it leaked out, as all secrets do. Very soon after he left his house on the common, he said he had been prompted, but I always believe it was Betty's lapse that made him do it. Perhaps when out of the way of Sammy's fascinations, she settled down into a respectable married woman and raised families that were a credit to her forebears. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. The Death of Luath and Sammy. After Biddy's going, life as far as the dogs were concerned seemed very quiet. I never knew whether Sammy missed her as much as he ought to have done. He was quieter and more detached than ever. He and Luath were inseparable, but alas, Luath was showing every day more and more signs of age. He was never ill. I don't think he ever had a vet after those early years, but day by day he was slower in his movements, slower in his brain. The tragedy was when he could no longer get into the car, but the last time he went, he fell as he was getting out. One morning he failed altogether, would eat no food, and could hardly move about. Not ill, only grown old and worn out. I saw the end must be very near, and that it would be merciful to spare him the last hours of weakness. That awful night before, as if he knew, he followed me, falling at every step, wherever I went. So at last I sat still, and he lay at my feet, his eyes rarely leaving my face. A bed was made up for him in the hall, but in the morning he had managed to crawl upstairs and lay in his usual place outside the door. When I came down, he was dead. The farmer had shot him. He was buried in the paddock at the end of the garden. Whilst his grave was being dug, Sammy, distracted at the sight of his old friend lying rigid on the grass, rushed despairingly between the house and the paddock to try to make me come and do something. I never saw Luath after he was dead, and I am sorry for it. I think he would have liked me to be there when he was put into his grave. But at the last my courage failed. I don't know how people feel about little dogs, but a big one is much the same as having another person in the house. He lives with you so intimately that he becomes what you are. It was 14 years since the arrival of that poor little forlorn sick puppy, and 14 years is a large slice out of one's life. Much water had flowed under the bridge during them, but I think every one of them had brought Luath unbounded happiness and contentment. Life to him was a simple affair. Why on earth humans made such a mess of things he couldn't understand. You had only to do your best with whatever came along, and look neither behind nor before. And there you were, happy. Why worry? He had a lot of common horse sense. To lose a loved dog is to lose a valued friend. His going left a large and melancholy gap. The house seemed empty and desolate. At night I found myself listening for the thud of his heavy body against the door. In the morning I expected to fall over him when I went to my bath. Sammy and I wandered about the common forlorn, hardly daring to go near the specially loved spots where we had all been so happy. Poor little Sammy, he had become so dependent on Luath. Now he had no one to show him what to do, which way to go, where to find the rarest scents. He floundered pathetically trying to think out things for himself. There was always something uncommonly touching about Sammy, a bit of him quite unlike the others. He seemed to live a detached life all to himself. Porthos had his past and Luath his present, but I always felt that what interested Sammy was his future. He never made much of this world. A rum place, I am sure he thought it, with rum people in it, and distinctly a rum set of dogs on the common. His eyes were seldom empty of a gentle ironic humour. He never got over the death of Luath, and within 3 months he was also dead. I was awakened one night by his whimpering, and found him on the chair, breathing with difficulty. I lifted him up onto the bed, and tried to soothe him, but directly the light was out, he began crying again, so pitifully. I relit the candle, and remained with him for the rest of the night. In the morning he was so weak that he had to be carried downstairs. A bed was made for him on the sofa, near the fire, in the dining room, and a vet was sent for. It was distemper, he said, with heart complications. He had already been through distemper, but it seems that dogs can have it more than once. Everything possible was done for him. Chicken broth every few hours, at others a spoonful of brandy and water. He swallowed it all, without a murmur, but only because I gave it to him. He lay there like a sick child. It was impossible to leave him for any time. When I went to the table to eat my meals, he moaned, but when I sat by his side he became quiet. I tried to interest him in the things he used to love to play with. His collar, the newspaper, a cushion. But his eyes, fixed on my face, showed only the slightest flicker of recognition. The day before he died, I was obliged to go into the town to buy something for him ordered by the vet. On my return, I at once hastened to him and saw he was not there. In a panic, I rushed into the garden calling his name, through to the paddock and found him at the extreme end, prostrate on Luath's grave. God knows how he had the strength, weak as he was, to get so far. I picked him up in my arms and carried him into the house, nearly dead. All that day and the next I hardly left him. He liked me to sit near him, to caress him, to say to him fond, endearing words. In the afternoon of the next day, he seemed a little better. His breathing was less laboured. A friend dined with me that night. After dinner, we stood looking down at Sammy. "He is better," I said, and as I spoke, he gave a sigh and died. We buried him in the paddock next to Luath. It is 7 years since Luath and Sammy died. I have never had another dog, but my heart still turns soft at the sight of a puppy. Again, I live near Kensington Gardens. Every corner of them holds some dear memory. And from out of these memories the dogs come to me. I see them playing in and out of the trees as they used to do. Porthos, Luath, Billy, Sammy. Now they catch sight of me. With a shout they are upon me. Luath first, again as fleet of foot as any of them. But there is another I would have. Has she not always been with them? I summon her forth, and my youth stands before me. We gaze long at one another, then we clasp hands, and away we go to visit the places we used to know so well. She remembers so much that I had forgotten. A tree here, a landmark there. It was here that Luath fought a dog and hurt his leg. It was there that Porthos flung off his muzzle and brought it to me to carry instead. Now it is Billy flying madly after the sheep. He reaches the Serpentine and is in the water before we have turned the corner. Little Sammy creeps close to me. He's frightened at seeing so many new things. The sheep with their thick woolly coats, so different from those on the common, and the trees with their black trunks. And what a lot of water, not a bit like the little friendly ponds along the roads. Dear Sammy, he seems so young, so timid. I want to hold him as I used to when he was very, very little. I sit down on the grass. Snozzle, I say, and there is his darling head hidden in my skirts. My youth is running about with the other dogs, now all dripping with water. The same old game, up and down, all gone mad by the sight of the Serpentine. Sammy and I sit there so long, so happy. But now it is getting late. The gates will soon be shut. Already I hear in the distance the keepers. All out, all out. Goodbye, darling, darling, darling dears. We'll meet again. Tomorrow, they cry. Yes, yes, I answer. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. End of Dogs and Men by Mary Ansell.